That 56 seconds it took me to swim that gold medal win, I looked for that feeling for 30 years and I never found it.
A podcast about the people behind the medals. On the Podium from the BBC World Service. Find it wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Welcome to The Inquiry. I'm Charmaine Cozier. Each week, one question, 4 expert witnesses, and an answer. July 2023. Work, or rather a particular way of working, is having an appraisal. During the COVID-19 pandemic, doing your job from home became the norm for millions of people around the world. Fast forward 3 years to now, and many of those remote workers want to keep it that way. But Google, Meta, and the biggest bank in America, JP Morgan Chase & Co., are just some of the companies telling staff to return to the office for some or all of their working week. It seems major employers are having second thoughts. So this week we're asking, is work from home working?
Part 1. Out of office.
What the pandemic did was basically force society en masse to try out working from home. And what that meant was we were able to learn that it works, and we were able to experiment with it collectively.
Jose Maria Barrera is Assistant Professor of Finance at ITAM, one of the top universities in Mexico. He also co-founded the WFH Research Project, which has been gathering data and running surveys on remote working since just after the first lockdown started in 2020.
So the idea, I think, before the pandemic that was fairly widespread is that if you're working remotely, you're basically out of the sight of your manager or your employer. And so it was fairly easy to use the economist word shirk. Basically not be working as diligently as you would be in the office. The pandemic basically changed that because by forcing everybody to be at home, they kind of made it basically not a faux pas to say, hey, I would like to work from home. And it sort of broke that kind of narrative that when somebody asks to work from home, it must be because they don't want to work very hard.
WFH Research questioned several thousand people in the US about their working arrangements. It also runs a global survey in 34 countries.
So interestingly, we see some variation in the amount of working from home across countries. So it seems that English-speaking countries, so the UK, the US, Canada, tend to have higher levels of working from home than, say, other developed countries in Europe. And then kind of some of the lower levels of working from home that we see are from countries in Latin America and in Asia.
Jose Maria Barrera says there are various reasons for that.
For example, a lot of Asian countries controlled COVID in 2020 fairly well, so they had pretty short lockdowns, and basically people probably didn't get very used to working from home in 2020. And so it didn't become a habit that they kind of grew into. Typically, I'd say Latin American economies tend to have more of the sorts of jobs that you need to be at the worksite in person in order to do.
In the US, an estimated 60% of workers can't do their jobs from home.
So a lot of these are kind of retail jobs, manufacturing jobs that basically cannot be done unless you are physically at the workplace.
Others can split their working week between home and company premises.
And that is actually the predominant mode of working from home. So hybrid workers are about 28 to 30% of the workforce. And kind of the remaining small share of the workforce is those that are fully remote, typically in occupations that don't require that much interaction. So for example, if you're in IT support or in payroll, that 10% or so of the population are typically the ones that are going to be in fully remote roles.
Regardless of where they are in the world, people responding to Jose Maria Barrera's survey seem to want the same things.
So consistently, the main upsides seem to be avoiding commuting. And here I'm talking monetary costs. So for example, the cost of getting lunch or paying for gas or petrol. And to some extent, it's getting a little bit more quiet time and kind of being able to work in an environment where they feel more comfortable. What we see consistently is that workers would like to work from home more than their employers want them to. But because employers have over time become more positive about working from home, kind of the gap between employees and employers has narrowed significantly. It's still there, especially in the US, but it's narrowed significantly.
That gap has narrowed, but it hasn't disappeared, so room for suspicion remains.
So employees, on average, when we ask them, do you feel more productive while working from home or while working at the work site? On average, they tell us that they feel more productive while working from home. Employers seem to tell us the opposite, that they seem to tell us that if everybody came back into the workplace 5 days a week, that things would be more productive. And I think behind it is basically some problems in communication and setting goals and expectations between these two groups, which may lead employers, basically senior managers, feeling a little bit paranoid about what is it that my employees are doing when they're working from home. When we started this data gathering project, we had this idea that basically the pandemic could catalyze a persistent shift. So kind of since the pandemic has ended, a majority of people tell us that attitudes towards working from home have become much more positive.
But that's not the case everywhere.
Part 2. Belonging to the group.
The difference between Japan's attitude towards working from home compared to the Western practices, I think, lies in the very distinct Japanese corporate culture that values and based on collectivism. It's also consensus seeking as a basis for management decisions, and this is, of course, influences how Japanese work in the office or from home.
Dr. Sayori Sugeno is a lecturer at the University of Surrey Business School. She spent more than 20 years living and working in Japan.
So I experienced corporate culture, and I was wondering how a pandemic will affect this culture, and will this culture change or not. And so that is why I genuinely was curious about how the pattern and working pace of Japanese people will change, and it looks like it is changing, but not probably as much as we could expect.
The traditional Japanese office environment emphasises intense dedication and deep commitment from staff. People often spend all their working lives with the same employer.
It is based on very important feelings of belonging to the group, to the team. Also, corporate culture, I think that is why the Japanese employees prefer to work in the office, because consensus building process is very much smoother and more personal when it is face-to-face.
Long hours followed by nights out with bosses and colleagues during the week is non-negotiable in many companies.
It is basically a part of the working day. It's really socializing, people talking basically about their work after their work hours. So it's supposed that people see each other in the office and then go for drinks. It is also peer pressure, and if somebody tries to skip, they may be seen as not a good team player.
And that makes the idea of doing their job from home even less appealing.
It's far beyond the corporate culture, and it doesn't matter is company small or big or large, it will always be there. So it very much influences the social behavior. So I mean that feeling that you somehow outside of the team, I don't think that for Japanese it's really pleasant.
An indication of the level of resistance in Japan to remote working was seen as COVID raged around the world.
During the pandemic, there was no strict lockdown like in other countries. There were government guidances all the way and recommendations. And in the midst of pandemic, I believe that government recommended that 70% of employees should stay at home. But this actually never happened. The statistics showed that in the midst of pandemic in Tokyo, slightly less than 50% worked from home, but it's still significantly less than government recommended 70%. And it shows that Japanese, they prefer to work in the office.
There were also national media reports exposing some bad experiences, which did little to win people over.
When people started working online, maybe it wasn't intentional, but some employees felt that they were harassed. For instance, like their bosses required to keep their cameras on all working hours, like 8 hours or so, and it's not really probably reasonable.
In May 2023, Japan lifted the last of its COVID restrictions. As pre-pandemic work patterns resume, it's clear that mass working from home isn't big in Japan.
I think it's very much depends on industry, on particular company, on the job positions. But compared to the Western countries or companies, I think that Japanese will tend more coming back to office.
Dr. Saori Sugeno suspects attitudes can shift more in favour of hybrid working as new and future employees enter the workforce. But it will take time.
Many of them prefer not to stay their whole life with the same company. And so this peer pressure, they don't feel it as strong as probably their parents' generation does. So I can see that the working patterns will be changing, but probably in the coming years, 20 years or so, there will be some changes.
From their battles on the world stage,
I gave everything for that race, and I was able to come away with something that I've dreamed about since I was a kid.
to their battles behind closed doors.
I had to reach some terrible bottoms in my addiction and suffer some really terrible consequences and suffer a lot of loss due to my drinking to get to where I am today.
On the Podium is the podcast where Olympians and Paralympians share their stories. On the Podium from the BBC World Service. Find it wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Part 3. Remote controls.
Many companies, if they wanted to survive, they were forced to have their workers to work remotely.
Roman Gil is a partner with the Spanish law firm Sagadoy. It's also part of a global employment law alliance with multinational clients.
But as often happens with fast changes, the change came first than the law.
It all depends on where you are, but as well as laws, there are numerous other regulations, labour agreements and protections, including one for being able to log off without consequences.
There is a risk that through remote work, people are working too many hours and even always connected. In order to stop this, there is a regulation called Right to Disconnect, which is being implemented in many countries such as France, Italy, the Philippines or Canada. That involves that once the working time is over, the employee may disconnect and may not answer even if he or she is asked to do so by the employer, and the employer may not take any disciplinary action against the employee for not being available. And it's creating also a moral obligation to comply with that.
Working off premises is also causing some corporations to rethink remuneration.
That's already happening. And for example, in the financial industry in the US, we have seen cases in which some companies are arguing that they don't want to pay the salaries of, say, New York if someone is working in South Carolina or in Idaho, where it's cheaper to live, and why should they? And there is an ongoing discussion about that.
It's tricky because home utility bills creep up.
There are many regulations which impose on companies the obligation to compensate for specific costs of working remote. And then normally it's up to the negotiation between the parties, collective or individual, to establish the specific costs of that. But the trend is to make some compensation due to the increase of heating systems, of electricity, and certainly the company has to provide the specific means of production, such as computers and ergonomic furniture and equipment which is correct from a safety perspective to complete their jobs without injury or pain, and providing courses about how to do it properly, how to sit, when to move around, where to put the light, not to have cables around so you don't trip on them and fall.
So what happens if there's an accident? What happens in terms of liability?
We are having cases about that in courts already. The company should show first that it has informed the employee about the correct practices. But after that, it would still be a case-by-case issue. If, for example, it's due to a problem with the chair or with the computer, which was provided by the company, then it could be more difficult.
Canada, the US and the UK may have the most remote workers, but they're lagging when it comes to specific legislation.
The Netherlands are leading the way. They passed a law in Congress. It's still pending approval by Senate, but it's a law which makes it more similar to a right. It's not exactly a right. The ability of an employee, due to her or his interest, to work remotely. How it works is that the employer must accept it, except if the employer proves that it's not feasible or reasonable.
If it happens, the legal burden will be on employers to justify why a remote working request has been rejected.
Some other countries are doing similar things. My own country, Spain, is very similar. It's allowing employees to ask for an adaptation of their working conditions, including the possibility to work remote. And the company must negotiate for a month. And the company must try to accommodate the need of the employee. And if it doesn't, because the company thinks it's damaging for its interest, the employee may even go to court, and it would be a judge who, in the end, decides about it.
Remote working isn't restricted to homes. Skilled people are holding down jobs that can be done online while travelling around the world.
So there was not a clear way how to regulate that. And now there are specific visas. They are called digital nomad visas. For any foreigner planning to live in a foreign country as a resident, working remotely for an employer which might perhaps not even have any affiliate, any subsidiary in that country. And we have regulations already offering that in Mexico, in Dubai, in Norway, in Germany, in Greece, in Italy, in Taiwan, and in some other countries.
It's unusual because it's the worker, not the employer, who decides where and when they go.
And that certainly creates issues regarding taxation, social security contribution, and even expenses, which must be tackled in a different way from regular or old-fashioned expatriates.
Can a company really know where all of its employees are?
Not always. I had a case which a multinational company told me that it had realized that an employee was in Australia, and this was a European company, ever after the pandemic, and was not aware of it. And that was creating issues with the visas and with the work permits, and they were a bit annoyed. But more and more, it's very difficult to know where an employee is.
Part 4. Home Alone.
One of the challenges when working from home is, of course, the lack of connections with colleagues.
Vlad Rivkin is an Associate Professor of Organisational Behaviour at Trinity Business School in Dublin, Ireland.
And if you live on your own, basically your work to some degree becomes your family, and when this is taken away, then it has a detrimental impact on mental health.
It was a situation people found themselves in during pandemic lockdowns. Then and now, many remote workers keep in touch through video conferencing. However,
previous research has demonstrated that it can drain your mental energy more than being in a face-to-face meeting because of a lack of the ability to display properly emotions, because the communication can be more difficult.
failure to address pressures on mental health also carries consequences for companies.
Because if you have somebody who suffers from burnout or maybe even depression, then they'll probably go on sick leave for around 6 months. You need to maybe reorganize work, you need to ask colleagues to cover, and this all incurs costs which can be sort of saved if organizations take care of people's mental health.
Doing your job from home can destroy the boundary between life and work, even more so if your home was filled with company-supplied equipment and furniture, or if you don't have caring responsibilities. Checking emails and working on documents roll on with no clear signal to power down, like leaving an office or starting a long commute.
And one of the challenges that remote workers face is basically how to create or maintain these boundaries. And we actually just submitted a piece of research on that, where we developed an intervention to create boundaries. And interestingly, what we found is that one of the effective strategies was to change one's clothes. So basically in the morning to put on maybe something that you wear normally for work, and then in the evening change into your more normal clothes. And in our study, this has shown to have an effect on helping people to detach from work, especially in the evening after work.
Other suggestions include leaving home for a walk or a jog. Spending part of the week in the office and the rest at home appears to offer the best of both worlds, but it needs coordination, structure and collaboration to work.
Now the question is, what does this hybrid look like? Because one of the predominant reasons for people to go into work is basically to meet other colleagues. And of course, if I go into work, but all my colleagues are at home, then there is no point for me to go into work. So I think what organizations need to think about, and managers as well, is to basically find incentives to get people into work on the same day. And the other question is, why do we need to be at work? And what I can imagine in that regard is that there will be days with full-on meetings, so people will go in, they will have team meetings, they will have individual meetings, and then on other days there will be sort of remote work where they work from home on more individual tasks.
It's also important not to overlook what being in the office always, sometimes or never might mean for people's careers.
And this very nicely links to the glass ceiling effect that we know for female employees. And I think despite efforts to tackle this still exists. And what we may experience is a similar glass ceiling effect, but rather for remote workers. Because obviously when it comes to promotions, when it comes to career success, visibility is an important factor. Relationships are an important factor. So being a good worker is of course also important, but it's not the be-all end-all. Now there are ways around it to have more objective promotion processes, but I think as a recommendation, having at least sort of some visibility in the office. I think it will be the major trend. In fairness, some professions will still work on site. It can be made to work, but I think we are not there yet. There is a lot of things we do in terms of finding out what types of hybrid work environments or arrangements we want to work in. And of course, there is the managerial side. Currently, it's probably less detrimental than helpful, but I think in the next few years, maybe in the next 5 years, we will figure out ways to make it work.
So is work from home working? Many people who do are more than happy, so it's a yes from them. For others sharing small living spaces with no privacy and weak Wi-Fi, it's stressful. Worries over negative impacts on pay and promotion chances and company concerns over productivity rates aren't going away. Businesses hoping to start or sustain it have a lot of work to do. Depending where in the world they are, there'll be multiple employment laws and rules to navigate. So expect more tension between employers and employees eager to balance their labour with their lives. This edition of The Inquiry was presented by me, Charmaine Cozier, produced by Jill Collins and researched by Matt Tolson. The editor is Tom Bigwood and the technical producer, Kelly Young.